Hello all, I want to welcome you to our biochemistry class. This is supposed to be an in-person class, but because of the current health challenges all over the world, it has necessitated that this class becomes an online class for the time being. And at this point, I'm not very optimistic of the time of resumption, but I won't be surprised if we do this quarter completely online. However, the content will be provided as usual and the quality will be maintained. And then feel free to always talk to me through the usual channel, either send me the emails. I can also send Zoom invites for meetings if you want to talk to me live and get live reactions as well. And some of the lectures can also be done either on Skype or Zoom depending on what is enabled. But I'm going to start up this one with video recording. Today we'll be talking about chapter 1. Of course, the books we're going to be using is Biochemistry by Campbell, Farrell, and McDougall. And most of those information can be found in your syllabus in the Canvas. The Canvas is very important for this course. Make sure you always check it from time to time, because at this level, everything is done online at the moment. Let us just start the lecture immediately. So today we're looking at chapter 1. Chapter 1 is just a brief snapshot of what biochemistry is all about. So we'll be talking about biochemistry and the organization of the cells. And we're going to know what biochemistry is and how does it actually relate to the cells. And why do we have to put it together with the cells themselves, So let's see what it is. So the basic themes first. The basic biochemistry is a multidisciplinary in nature. It is a multidisciplinary endeavor. It combines the knowledge of biology and chemistry. In fact, and that makes sense. If you look at the name is biochemistry. If you look at it, say biochemistry. We call it biochem. So this is typically a combination of biology and chemistry. So it uses the result for many sciences to answer various questions at the molecular level. In fact, at this point, we are looking at the molecular level of life, and that is why we can define it in a snapshot as the chemistry of life processes. So remember, we've been talking about chemistry. We've taken a lot of chemistry and inorganic chemistry and organic chemistry, whereby the focus was the focus of those classes was actually on inorganic substances. But in this case, we're going to be focusing how does chemistry happen in a living substance. So that allows us to answer questions about the molecular nature of life processes. Of course, organisms can be studied using the method of chemistry and physics in all living things. Of course, when we talk about physics, we talk about energy and changes of energy. We talk about chemistry, we talk about reactions and composition of matter. So if you bring the two of them together, right, of course, every molecule will always use the same type of biomolecules. We'll talk about biomolecules later. We will talk about biomolecules. We're referring to those molecules such as proteins, the lipids, the nucleic acid. We'll talk about them. And energy, of course, there are energy stored in these biomolecules, and these energies change from one form to another. And those are those concepts that we're going to begin to appreciate by the time we move into this class. Of course, life originated from somewhere. There are a lot of theories of the origin of life. Some of them are religious, some of them are scientific, some of them are logical. But whatever origin is, there is one similarity in the origin of life. The interesting similarity in every origin of life is that life originated from simple molecules, from simple substances. Those substances include stuffs like water, methane, carbon dioxide, ammonia, nitrogen, hydrogen, oxygen is not listed. So these simple molecules must have arisen from where? Atoms, of course. Water is a molecule. So how do you make water? 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom comes together to make molecules. So these simple molecules must have arisen from from atoms themselves. And there are reactions of these simple molecules that lead to the formation of giant molecules. That makes sense. For it to form, of course, we'll talk about this much later. For it to form a simple sugar is in photosynthesis, whereby what happens there? whereby CO2 gas, remember, the CO2 combines with water to form glucose molecule. And it is this glucose molecule that polymerizes further to form even giant molecule like the polysaccharide. The polysaccharide will include stuff like, let's say starch or glycogen are all polysaccharides. So you find out that no matter whatever the theory of life is, life would have arisen from the combination of simple molecules. So, and that will take us to the levels of organization of life. You see, in the level of organization of life, it is an interesting way of scientifically, it's a scientific way of putting together how life originated from simple atoms. Okay, and it makes a lot of sense. Now, let's see what happens here. Now, every life originated from atom. So, this is the simplest. Atoms come together, like oxygen atoms or hydrogen atoms come together to form water molecule. Or carbon atom come together with oxygen to form carbon dioxide. So, every life originated from those simple atoms, which combine to form the molecules. Now, the molecules themselves combine to form macromolecules. Those macromolecules, or you can call them the biomolecules. Now, the biomolecules themselves will now combine to begin to form much more structural parts, what we call the organelles. Organelles are structural part of the cell. They are the structural parts of the cell. And they have specific functions like they play. A good example is like the mitochondria. The mitochondria is usually called the powerhouse of the cell. It is the point of energy generation. It is at this in the mitochondria that energy is generated to power various metabolic activities. Now, a collection of these cell organelles, like mitochondria and a few other organelles like the Golgi apparatus, the nucleus, the cell membranes, and every other part of it will come together to form the cell. So the cell, of course, we usually call the cell the simplest unit of life. It is at this point that you begin to see a unit that has a life, because some organisms exist as a unicellular level and they still maintain every metabolic processes in them. And then combination of different types of cells will form the tissue. The tissue is just a combination of different types of cells that perform distinct functions. They come together to form the tissue. And now if you have a collection of tissues too, you now form the organ. Organ can be the heart, the liver, the bone. Those are all organs. It can be the liver, it can be the heart, it can be the spleen, it can be any other stuff that forms that becomes the organ, the pancreas. So, and then if you put all these organs together, you now form what we call, some textbooks, some authors will call it the organ system, but you can just call it the system of the organism. So you find that it makes a scientific logical sense that life would have arisen from simple, that's exactly what this is saying, from simple to complex molecule, from simple substances to complex human beings, to complex humans, which are actually organisms that make up and have distinct functions, various functions they do in themselves. So that is how life is organized. Let's take it to the next level. So what are these chemical foundations? Let's now look at the chemical foundation of biochemistry. The chemical foundation of biochemistry is purely based on organic chemistry. Of course, organic chemistry, as you have known, most of you have taken the organic series. If you should be in your part 3 of the organic series by now. Organic series defines the study of carbon and its compound. And of course, most times hydrogen comes in here and there to pop it, to make it complete. So it's basically the study of carbons, right? And all the biomolecules we'll be referring to contain what? They contain carbon as the main chain, as the main element, and then they contain hydrogen, oxygen, and a few other elements like nitrogen and phosphorus, as we're going to see. So biomolecules are part of the subject matter of organic chemistry. That makes sense because they are cellular apparatus of living organisms that are made up of carbon compounds themselves. Basically, like if you say carbohydrate now, made up of sugars, carbon is there. Like glucose has carbon. If you talk about amino acids, they have carbon. If you talk about lipids, they have carbon. So carbon remains a particular backbone for these biomolecules. And of course, you know that Friedrich Wöhler was the first person who in 1828 told us that organic chemistry is not necessarily the chemistry of only those things that can be found in the human being, because he was the first person that synthesized urea. He synthesized urea from ammonium cyanide in the lab. He heated this in the lab and he was able to produce this. And urea, of course, is what you find in the urine, which is an organic metabolite. Is an organic metabolite in the human being. So that doesn't necessarily mean that you can always produce all these organic compounds outside, or you cannot. That doesn't mean that you have to only produce organic compound only in living stuffs. So it is also possible that, and that from that definition, Friedrich Wöhler demolished what we call in those days the vital force theory, because the vital force theory believes that you can only make organic molecules in living organisms, and that there is a force that holds them together. There is forces that hold them together, especially in those living things. So with the experiment of Friedrich Wöhler, this notion of vital force was demolished. So this is urea. We're going to see this by the time we talk about the urea cycle. It's an important component of the urine, and that is actually the structure of urea. Let us move on from there. Now we're going to be looking at major groups of biochemicals that are commonly encountered in biochemistry. The first one we're going to talk about is the amino acid. Amino acid contain, like we said, all of them have to be built around carbon. So it contains a central carbon, which we usually call the alpha carbon. We usually call this carbon the alpha carbon. Look at it. This is the alpha carbon. Now this alpha carbon is attached to three things. One, is attached to a carboxylic group, here written as an ionized form, the way it exists at the physiological pH, ionized. So this is the carboxylic group. It's attached to a carboxylic group. And then a hydrogen. This is hydrogen. Then it has an arrow group. In this case, this is alanine. We call this the arrow group, the side chain. The side chain of amino acid is what identifies as amino acid and gives it its characteristics, its uniqueness. We're going to see this as we move on. This is just, like I said, a snapshot of what we're going to see. This is what we're talking about here. It's just a snapshot. Let me write this thing well. This is carboxylic group in ionized form. Remember. So now it has what? The amino group. Here, the amino group also in ionized form, because amino group behaves as a base. Is a base, and it has the ability to accept the hydrogen to become ionized as ammonium ion. Whereas this guy acts as an acid which loses the hydrogen to become carboxylate ion. And that is exactly what you have here. This is alanine. Of course, they are three-dimensional in nature with respect to the position of the amino group. When the amino group is to the left, it is L configuration. When it is to the right, it becomes the D configuration. So this is the amino group. The second group of chemicals we're going to be looking about is carbohydrate. Carbohydrates are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen commonly, and in fact, they're built on this simple empirical formula. So if N is equal to, let's say, 2, you multiply everything by 2, you have the new formula. The least number of carbons it can contain, is 3. So, and above. So usually, for the simple sugars, you can build them up between 3 and 6, and then from there. So simple sugars or the monosaccharide or sugars are common, and they are the source of metabolic energies for all living things. So this is the glucose, the open structure of glucose, which you call the fixture projection. This is the fixture projection, and this is the cyclic projection or the cyclic projection, we call it the Howard projection. We're going to see this. So this is alpha glucose because this is actually positioned down. When if it is positioned above this arrow, we call it the beta D glucose. And the D glucose is because the pronoted ultimate carbon has the hydroxy group to the right. If this is placed to the left, it becomes L glucose. Then let's look at the next biochemical, the nucleotide. Of course, the nucleotide are the basic unit of hereditary. This is where this is the most important informational molecule. It's an informational molecule because this is what passes the information of the parent to the offspring. And the basic unit of those, both the deoxyribonucleic acid and ribonucleic acid, they form the molecular currency of the cell as well. Not just that, the molecular currency of the cell, or what we call the energy currency of the cell, the ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is built on the nucleotide. Of course, the nucleotide are composed of the 5-carbon sugar, the ribose sugar. This is what we call the 5-carbon sugar, the ribose sugar. That's where they get the name from. And then they have a phosphoric anhydride, depending on which one. For adenosine triphosphate, it has 3 phosphoric acid combined together. And this phosphoric anhydride is an energy-rich bond, which when broken, releases enough metabolic energy to power various metabolic activities. So this is adenosine triphosphate. So this is adenine. Now this is a triphosphate and a hydride, and this is a ribose. So when you combine all of them together, this you call it adenosine. These two is called adenosine. If you combine these two, you call them adenosine, and this is triphosphate. All right, but we're going to see this as we move on in this class. As we move on, so lipids are class of compounds that are much more insoluble in water. They are very insoluble in water because they contain long chains of hydrocarbon. Interestingly, the lipids contain polar groups. You know, the lipids contain a polar group. Now, the polar group is usually the carboxylic group. But because the chain length is too much, this is too long, that dispersion force begins to play an important role. Dispersion forces plays an important role in overwhelming the power of this small carboxylic group, that lipids are generally insoluble in nature, despite the fact that they have a polar. So, and they're said to be amphipathic. Amphipathic means is that, now this side, like I said, is non-polar. You say this is non-polar, or you can say hydrophobic. Non-polar, or you can say hydrophobic. And whereas this place is, how will I put it? This is polar or hydrophilic. I don't have any space to put my hydrophilic, so I can put it here. This side means it likes water. Hydrophilic. So now other examples of lipid are the cholesterol. The cholesterol, which tend to not be good nutritionally these days because it's been thought to contribute a lot in the development of cardiovascular diseases. All right. So the next one we're going to be talking about, the next concept we'll be looking into now is the functional groups. So functional groups, like you did in organic chemistry, of course, functional groups are those special group of molecules or atoms that form the characteristics structure of molecules, and not just the structure. They determine the chemical characteristics of that molecule. They give it its identity. So a functional group will give a class of molecules this identity, and there are different functional groups we're going to be talking about, and that functional groups actually gives that particular class of compound their name. The alcohols are known to contain the OH groups. Of course, the alcohols have the OH groups. The carboxylic acid will contain the carboxylic functional groups, and all the rest. So we're going to be seeing some of those in this example. So esters and anhydrides of phosphoric acid are also of vital importance in biochemistry. I already talked about this. The adenosine triphosphate is the energy currency of the cell, and it contains an anhydride linkage involving phosphoric acid. It contains more than 2 phosphoric acid, and those 2 phosphoric acid those bonds are rich in energy that when they are broken, they help to power metabolic activities, like I already said earlier. So I'm going to write that very well, and I'm going to show you a table of my functional groups. So look at the functional groups. Now, apart from the alkanes that contain carbon to carbon single bond, every other class of organic compound contains at least a double bond or an oxygen and nitrogen in its functional groups. And this is exactly what we're going to see. So the alkanes carbon to carbon double bonds, of course, that's what it is. Then the alcohols contain OH groups. The ethers contain OH groups. The amines contain the N group. This is an example here. This is methylamine. And then the thiols contain SH group. The aldehydes, of course, must have at least one hydrogen. That's the difference between aldehydes and ketones. The aldehydes have one hydrogen to the carbonyl carbon, whereas these guys have no hydrogen. They have two other groups on both sides. The carboxylic group will have to contain the COOH. This is the carboxylic group, which will encounter a lot. The esters contain, for esters, this H group is removed and added with another arrow group. Alright, so it contains a carbonyl carbon and ether. That's exactly what the esters are. The amide group is a combination of the carboxylic group and the amide group to form this. So you have an amide group and then a carbonyl group. Of course, we're going to talk about this as we move on. The phosphoric acid, of course, is just the phosphate H2PO4. It's a common phosphoric acid. However, if you have two phosphoric acid combined together, they form what we call the phosphoric anhydride. If you look at this now, this is an ester bond. So an ester bond of a phosphoric acid is what we call a phosphoric anhydride. So instead of having carbon in this ester bond now, what do you have? You now have, instead of having COO, look at it, you now have PO. And combined to another phosphoric acid. So you must have at least two phosphoric acid combined together in a phosphodiester bond to form. So this bond is what we call phosphodiester bond. Okay, let me show you what that looks like. So if you see this bond now, I'm going to put it this way. I have space to do that. So this is now. So this is a phosphoric anhydride. What do you find here now? There are two esters here, right? So this is an ester of this bond. So this is what we call phosphate ester bond, or you can say phosphodiester bond. So this is a phosphate ester bond is what we call a phosphoric anhydride. And it is, like I said, it is breaking of this bond releases a lot of energy that can be coupled to metabolic reactions, as we will see. Move on. So this is a typical of what's happening. Two phosphoric acid combines together to form an anhydride of phosphoric acid, like I already showed you. So this is also an ATP reaction. So ATP and its reaction forms in that form. So look at this. This is an anhydride now. This is another anhydride. So this is a phosphodiester bond in these two. And then this is adenine, like I told you, and this is ribose to form this all-important molecule ATP, which we call the energy currency of the cell. We're going to understand why this is very, very much important. Because if you have money and you cannot buy anything, that makes you useless. So the best way to transact the best way the cells transact for energy is to get this common energy currency, which is called the energy currency of the cell, ATP. And let us move on to the next slide. So abundance of elements with relative to carbon. You know, carbon, like I said, is the most abundant in organic molecule. The most abundant in organic molecule. However, there are other ones that are also abundant, like hydrogen follows. Hydrogen is also very abundant. Nitrogen, oxygen, and then other ones like sodium can be encountered. Magnesium, phosphorus, sulfur, potassium, calcium, magnesium, iron, zinc, and other trace metals can be found from time to time. Particularly when we talk about the enzymes, we find out that enzymes are affiliated with some type of trace metals which help them to do their function. And those metals that help enzymes to do their function is what we call the cofactors. We're going to talk about that by the time we get at that point. So now let's introduce the last concept we're going to be talking about here, or second to the last concept, the biomolecules. Biomolecules are those large macromolecules that are built from those simple biochemicals that we talked about earlier. So, of course, they are derived, we call them biomolecules because they are bigger. They are macromolecules themselves. Now, of course, every macromolecule is built from small molecules. Those small molecules that build up these macromolecules are what we call the monomers. So the monomers are small molecules that may bond to many others to form the polymers. The polymers are the big ones, whereas the monomers are so the polymers are macromolecules formed by bonding of the small unit. The small unit are what we call the polymers. So the word is a Greek word. Mono means mono plus meros means monomers. So mono means simple molecules. Meros means the part. So the combination of those two gives you monomers. So what are those examples we're going to be looking at? The proteins. The first one, the proteins. The proteins are the macromolecules that are built on monomeric units of the amino acids. So the amino acids come together, held together by peptide bonds. The amino acids, if this is an, okay, let me use my red now. So if this is an amino acid AA, it's connected to another amino acid, it's connected to another amino acid. This amino acid bonds is actually called what? They're held together by peptide bonds. So to form the large proteins. Then the nucleotides are held to, the nucleic acids are the polymers. And they're made up of the various nucleotides. So the nucleotides come together to form the nucleic acid. A good example of a nucleotide can also be the AMP or the ADP, like I gave you an example earlier. So an ATP is a nucleotide on its own. An AMP, which is adenosine monophosphate, is a nucleotide as well. So AMP or ADP, they combine together to form the big one. Then other ones we're going to see is the carbohydrate. The carbohydrates are built from simple sugars. So the carbohydrate, or the polysaccharide, are the big carbohydrate, the polysaccharide that are built from the monomeric unit. So a good example again, we can see them from, if you have like two glucose molecules. So if you have glucose, it can be combined to another glucose. And in fact, they're held together by what we call, the bonds in glucose are actually called the glycosidic bonds. Those bonds are called the glycosidic bond to form the polysaccharide. So again, like I said, to the right, all the right we have here are the polymers. To the left we have the monomers. These are the polymers. Alright. So a good example of a polymer here can be, of a carbohydrate can be, you can have starch. You can also have cellulose. You can have glycogen and all the rest. And then the last but not the least, the lipids. The lipids are not particularly polymers themselves, but are also built up from simple molecules. Because they don't form really chains, but are built up. So a good example is a triglyceride. A triglyceride is a lipid. A triglyceride, let me use my red this time. We call it triglyceride or TG. You can call it short form TG. A TG is built from 3 fatty acid and 1 glycerol molecules combined together by an ester bond. So that's what we call it. In fact, this is actually called triacyl glycerol because it has a glycerol that is esterified to 3 different fatty acids, and then we call it a triacyl glycerol. So that's a good example of lipids. So of course, like I said, the polymers are macromolecules formed by bonding of this small unit, and from the name, polymer means, poly means, in Greek, poly means many, meros also means part. So this is many parts. Like in this one, when we talked about it, this one means what? Single part. Here it means many parts. And like I said, those molecules listed to the right side are the polymers. Those ones to the left are the monomers. Now, when monomers combine together to form polymers, they do that in a particular directional sense. That directional sense is very important to the structure and functions of those molecules, of those compounds, or let me put it this way, that they're important to the structure and functions depending on the part of the body where they are found. If they don't combine in that sense, there will be a pathology, and that could lead to serious either structural or metabolic malfunction. All right, so let's see what happens here. Now, this is the strand of DNA. And if you look at this now, this strand of DNA is made up of, these are just the nitrogenous bases that are usually listed. All right, this is the thymidine, the cytosine, the adenine, the guanine, and the cytosine. These are all the things that are listed. And the connection is from 5' to 3'. The 5' is that the ribose sugar starts from carbon number 5 to carbon number 3. And that is how they are arranged. If they are not arranged in this way, they are not perfect, they are not going to function well. Again, if you look at the polypeptide, these are polypeptide. In this polypeptide, now this is phenylalanine, serine, asparagine, lysine, glycine, proline, and all the rest of them. Now, look at what happens here now. They are connected. We know this connection is a peptide bond. But the sequence of this arrangement of this polypeptide bond is unique. That if a particular protein does not have that specific sequence, there will be a malfunction in the structure of that polypeptide or enzymes or any other particular molecule that it is made from. The same thing goes for the polysaccharide. The polysaccharide, like this is a unit of glucose molecules that are combined together through various, okay, this will be what we call the glycosidic linkage. This is also, of course, this linkage, we're going to call it peptide linkage. So they have to be arranged in this sense. So the next two slides is going to show you that. Now this is a polypeptide, this is a dipeptide now. This is a generic one because we use R to represent them, so we didn't call it. Now, of course, every polypeptide will have the alpha carbon. To form a peptide, what happens here? The alpha carboxylic acid will combine with the alpha amino group of the next one to form a peptide. Of course, formation of a peptide bond is the constituent reaction because water molecule is lost. Now, look at what happens here. This guy will combine with this guy to form this peptide bond. Look at what we call a peptide bond. Now, this peptide bond must be connected in this direction. Of course, it starts with the N group. We call this the N terminal. Sorry, this is the N terminal. This is the N terminal of this amino acid going to, you see now, so it start, okay, let's go back to this. This starts with an N terminal. We call this the N terminal. And it ends with what? The C part. We call this the C. So M is the amino group terminal. This means the carboxylic acid terminal. So we call it the C terminal. Now, if the amino acid is not arranged in this way to form this polypeptide will lose its function, and that will be a serious problem for the particular peptide that is formed. Again, that happens in formation of the carbohydrate. In carbohydrate molecule, of course, this is the both conformation of sugar, glucose. Now, if you look at this now, this is carbon number 1. What is happening here is that the carbon number 1 is going to be combining with carbon number 4 at this point to form, of course, this again will lose one molecule of water, is a constituent reaction, to form this glycosidic linkage. This is glycosidic linkage. This is an acetal linkage as well. Now, this bond has to form between carbon number 1 and carbon number 4. For this to be, of course, 2 molecules of glucose will form, so this is what we call a maltose. A maltose is formed from 2 molecules of glucose. This directional sense from 1,4. So we say the bond formed here is actually, the bond formed here is called alpha, because, let's see, okay, no, this is not alpha, this is beta, because this is placed above the plane, right? So this is going to be beta, 1,4. This is going to be beta, 1 to 4 glycosidic bond. Remember, this bond is up. That's what we said it is. Beta. So this is down, this is up. So this is beta, 1 to 4, beta 1 to 4 glycosidic linkage or glycosidic bond. So this is a maltose. Basically, 2 molecules of glucose is supposed to be a maltose molecule. So this is exactly what you're going to be seeing as we move on. So if this directional sense is not maintained, there will be a problem. So that 1,4 connection is very, very important to the functionality of the macromolecule that will be formed from it. The same thing happens here again in nucleotide. Now, look at what happens here now. These two nucleotides combines together to form this. Look at what is happening here now. The first one now has an OH group at this place and a phosphate group at carbon number 5. Now, look at what happens here now. To form a phosphate, because they form the phosphate ester bond connecting between the two. The phosphate ester bond is formed between the OH group in carbon number 3 and the phosphate group in another nucleotide. So when this guy goes to combine with this guy, they form this phosphate ester bond. So this is a phosphate ester bond. A phosphate ester bond that is holding those, or we call it phosphoester bond, that is holding two nucleotides. So the combination has to always be from 5 to 3 in a sense. So if you look at it now, what is the direction? It goes from 5 prime here up to 3 prime, from 5 prime to 3 prime. For this particular dinucleotide to maintain a proper function, this directionality has to be followed. And these are not taken for granted in molecules, because any small misreading of this structure, there will be serious pathology. So there are other biomolecules we're going to talk about. Other biomolecules that will come of interest include enzymes. Enzymes are organic catalysts that also mediate or increase the rate of biological reaction. Biological reactions often do not occur as appreciable as inorganic reactions. But what enzyme does, of course, every enzyme will reduce. Of course, you know what enzyme does? Enzymes, what do they do? If this is the original activation energy, what the enzyme does is to come there to cut the activation energy so that reactions can occur really very fast. This is actually what the enzymes themselves do. So the genetic code is the relationship between the nucleotide sequence of a nucleic acid and the amino acid sequence. Of course, remember this, is that genetic code is what makes up the information that a parent is transferring to the offspring. So, of course, every amino acid or every polypeptide sequence is determined by the genetic code. If that genetic code is misread from the way that the nucleic acid are not, if it is misread or if it is read improperly from the nucleic acid, what it means is that the protein form is going to be defective and it's not going to have a correct functional ability like a normal structure is supposed to be. So the deoxyribonucleic acid DNA serves as an important coding material for human beings, and like I said, that is why we call it the ultimate informational molecule. That's exactly what it is. All right, so prokaryotes and eukaryotes. The prokaryotes are microorganisms that lack a distinct nucleus. In fact, their nucleus is not very developed like those of the multicellular animals or organisms. They lack distinct nucleus and membrane-enclosed organelles, and this includes usually the bacteria and the cyanobacteria. The eukaryotes are organisms whose cells are well defined and they have membrane-enclosed organelles. They can include the unicellular organisms like the yeast, the paramecium, the amoeba, and all the rest of them, and then the multicellular animals and plants. So I have this table shows you a quick comparison of the organelles in these two places. Now, if you look at the nucleus for the eukaryote, it's not definite nucleus. The DNA is present, but it's just the DNA, we call it the naked DNA, it's outside, it has nothing protecting it. Now, here, the nucleus is present, clearly present. The cell membrane is present, here it is present for both of them. The mitochondria, now, look at what happens here. None is present here. However, they have some enzymes or oxidation reactions in their plasma membrane, just scattered in their membrane. They don't have a specific organelle that is responsible for production of energy like we do in the eukaryotes. The endoplasmic reticulum, they don't have it. We have it here in the eukaryote. The ribosomes are also present in both of them. The chloroplasts are not present here. Of course, chloroplasts are only present in plants, and that is inside the chloroplast that photosynthesis takes place. So it is a responsibility to know the comparative differences between the eukaryotic cells and the prokaryotic cells, and that will take us to structure of the cell. You know, the cell is made up of different structures, and you have to know the different parts of the cell. You have to know how to draw the cell, label it completely, and know the different functions of the various parts of the cell. Of course, every cell is made up of the nucleus, which is centrally placed. Every eukaryotic cell is made up of a mitochondria, which of course I tell you is the powerhouse of the cell. Of course, endoplasmic reticulum plays an important role in transport and in synthesis as well of nucleic acid. So we have the rough and the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. The cell wall is only in the plant cell. The plant cell only has the cell wall. The cell wall gives it the rigidity. And then, so if we look at the summary of what I have here at this cell is in this table. This table tells you the various functions of the cell organelle. So the nucleus, look at it here. The nucleus is the main location of the genome. It is the site for the DNA and the RNA synthesis. It's very, very important. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. It's the site for the generation of what? ATP. Energy yielding oxidation reaction takes place there. It has its own DNA and as well. The chloroplast is only found in the plant cell and is the site for photosynthesis. The endoplasmic reticulum is a continuous membrane structure that goes throughout the cell. Now, there are two types. There is the smooth and the rough. This rough part is studded with the ribosomes and is the site for protein synthesis, whereas the smooth part plays an important role in transport, particularly of lipids. The Golgi apparatus are a series of membrane, flattened membranes in the cell. Their main function is the secretion of all proteins from cells and reactions that link sugars to other components. The lysosomes, I usually call them the soldiers of the cell. You see, lysosomes play an important role in what we call the lysis. That's why they get their names. Now, they contain hydrolytic enzymes that will destroy or kill any foreign bodies that comes to the cell. Lysis simply means breaking up. Those hydrolytic enzymes are going to break any foreign body that comes in there to attack the cell. The peroxisomes are sacs that contain enzymes involved in metabolism of hydrogen peroxide. The cell membrane is important because it is the outermost part of the animal cell, and its main function is to control what goes in and what goes out of the cell. So it also plays an important role as a protective layer and also transport. And then the cell wall is the rigid outer part of the cell, providing structure, definite structure and shape for the plant. The central vacuole is a membrane enclosed sac of the cell, which plays an important role in storage of specific materials. That's exactly what plays an important role. So these are all the functions of the cell. It is a responsibility to know the source functions of these organelles very detailed, because you're going to be seeing this in your quizzes. And also know how to draw and label all different types of cell, either of the plant cell, the animal cell, or the prokaryotic cell. All right. Sources of energy to life. You see, all cells require energy to survive. At any point in time where there is no energy, life ceases to exist. Now, of course, the sun is the ultimate source of energy, because that is from where the raw energies come from. Now, the raw energy comes in and is taken by the plant. The plant takes this energy in photosynthesis and then use it to synthesize food in which we eat. So photosynthetic organisms use the light energy from the sun to drive energy processes. So photosynthesis simply is made from simple molecules like water react with carbon dioxide to form glucose. Plus, what else happens here? It releases carbon dioxide as oxygen. It releases oxygen as waste product. So photosynthesis is not only providing a storage or a source of food for us, but it also helps the world. It helps the planet. It helps the earth to recycle oxygen, because we need oxygen to power various metabolic activities in the body. So this is the photosynthetic reaction. This is photosynthesis. Now, however, for photosynthesis to take place, it needs energy. It needs energy. So energy is actually needed here. So we're going to say energy plus this to take place. However, when this is being produced, what happens? Non-photosynthetic organisms like the human beings, the animals, what do? The animals will now take this food, eat it, and use it to generate energies for themselves in the process of what? Respiration. So this is what happens in respiration. This is tissue respiration. So what happens here? Let's see what happens here. What we're going to see here is we're going to have the carbohydrate C6H12O6 plus, now we now use oxygen, which we're breathing, and break this down into simple molecules of carbon dioxide and water. Now this process will now release enough energy. Of course, this energy again is in form of ATP, which is used to power the metabolic process. So you can just, if you look at these two reactions, you can say that photosynthesis is just the opposite of what? Photosynthesis is an opposite of what? Respiration. Of course, this releases energy, is an hexagonic process, whereas photosynthesis usually takes energy itself to make the process work, is an entagonic process. So this is exactly how energy is circulated in the biosphere. Alright, so thermodynamic principles is the study of transformation of energy transfer. Of course, change in energy depends on the state of the molecule present at the start of the process and at the end of the process. Now, there are two ways we can classify energetics of a chemical reaction. Now, if the change in free energy is negative, of course, free energy means the useful free energy gives useful energy that can be used to do work. Now, if this change is negative, what it means is that the energy of the reaction decreases, or you can say it is released. We say it is an endogonic reaction. Now, if this change is positive, what it means is that the free energy increases. And if it increases, this reaction will not occur unless it is prompted or through an external source. So, hexagonic reactions are actually spontaneous. Spontaneous and will occur in the direction as written. Whereas this reaction, the endogonic and non-spontaneous reaction. And for non-spontaneous reaction, they need to be prompted. They need to be stimulated by a source of external energy for the reaction to take place. So this is a very good example. So if you look at this process, if you throw a ball from a hill, it goes down easily. This is an hexagonic process because this is going to take place anyways. This is akin to what happens when ATP is hydrolyzed to ADP, and huge amount of energy is released, and this energy is used to power what? Is used to power metabolic processes. So the hydrolysis of ATP is highly hexagonic in nature. So energy change can take several forms, of course, and can be converted from one form to another. Of course, remember, the formation and breaking down of biomolecule involves a change in chemical energy, because chemical energy is stored in the bonds of all these chemicals. So breaking of this energy can release some of this energy to cells in respiration. So spontaneous process, I already talked about it, are the characteristics of a reaction in which a process takes place without outside intervention. Of course, and also we can know that the tendency of polar and non-polar molecules to exist in a separate phases is also a reflection of the energies of interaction between the individual molecule. Now, free energy is a diagnostic tool we can use for spontaneity. I already talked about this earlier. Now, we can use it to decide whether a reaction is hexagonic or spontaneous, or endogonic or non-spontaneous. Of course, when the free energy is less than 0, means it is what? A negative sign. The free energy, gives free energy is negative. Such reaction is energy releasing and is spontaneous. When it is what? Greater than 0, what it means is a positive, and such reaction is non-spontaneous. And for it to take place, it has to be coupled to an exergonic reaction for it to take place. And when delta G is 0, what it means that the reaction is in equilibrium, and the rate of forward reaction is equal to the rate of backward reaction. And that is what, if this is the forward reaction, this is the reverse. And we say this reaction is in equilibrium. Equilibrium. This is equilibrium reaction. This is what we mean by equilibrium reaction. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about is laws of thermodynamics. The first and second law of thermodynamics can be related to the Gibbs free energy, which says that delta G is equal to delta H is the heat of reaction, or we call it the enthalpy, heat of reaction. And of course, again, the heat of reaction can be positive or negative. It is positive. When it is positive, it's endothermic. When it is negative, it is exothermic. So that's the heat of reaction. Delta S is the entropy. Entropy measures the degree of disorderliness of a system. Degree of disorderliness of a system. Of course, the more disordered system is usually more spontaneous to take place than less disordered system. Of course, delta G is the change in free energy, and T is the temperature, but this temperature has to be in Kelvin temperature. So we can use this quantitatively to figure out which reaction is spontaneous or not. However, in this part of what we're going to do in this class is not to go into those calculations which you've done already in your Gen Chem, but the knowledge and review of this concept will help us build on this class. And at this point, this is the end of first lecture. Thank you once again for listening. If you do have any questions, do not hesitate to send me emails through Canvas or send me email directly from my Outlook email. And if you want us to meet one-on-one, request a meeting with me in my Zoom or my Skype, and we can easily talk. Thank you once again for listening, and do have a wonderful day, and bye at this point.